Setting is more than just the stuff behind the character. It opens the door for your reader to experience a wonderful or terrible world. Visual richness emerges from texture, form, light, color, and space, but settings can be so much more than just a pretty background. It's entwined with story, providing the context for everything occurring in the plot. Is your character plinking down the firing range or going on a killing spree in the boardroom? Change the setting, and it can radically alter the meaning of what is happening in the narrative.
Even more than that, setting holds the key to reader immersion. It can rise to the level of a character in and of itself, controlling mood, conveying thematic overtones, and whispering secrets about your story to the viewer. Let's dive in and see how, while noting tips and techniques on the drawing side of things.
First off, put your detective hat on. Or rather, understand that every reader is playing detective, whether they know it or not. As they read your book, readers subconsciously absorb every visual detail you include. Every backdrop can be like a crime scene. It tells a silent story. Or it doesn't.
If there is literally nothing there, readers will be navigating an empty, uninteresting world. But put secret stories in your environment, and they may be tempted to return again and again.
Let's return to these two scenes at the end of this video and analyze them. It's a fair fight, they're both prelude comics. One does the job of background, but the other goes above and beyond. By the end, you'll understand why and how.
While we want these lessons to be relatively bite-sized, there's no escaping the fact that a ton of stuff goes into backgrounds. We're going to dive right in. Later videos, we will explore some of the skills in more detail, but first, let's get our hands dirty and see how they are applied.
Rendering landscapes requires the drawing fundamentals covered in the first course. It also touches on spatial perspective design concepts like negative space and shaping language, color theory, light and shadow, the contrast principle, as well as naturalistic phenomenon like atmospheric perspective. Additional skills, juxtaposition, the rule of threes, camera angle, are also relevant, but we're going to focus more on those during the course on panel layout and shot composition.
Settings can seem intimidating at first. There are infinite possibilities. Literally anything in an imagined world could be in the mix. How do you know where to start?
First, remember to use a thumbnail. Planning out your landscape in a quick little doodle lets you play with possibilities quickly. And it is way easier to start a big, elaborate drawing if you have a little roadmap first. The thumbnail is a cheap way to settle on a camera angle, major compositional elements, and perspective before you dive into a full-size illustration. You don't want to change your mind on big picture elements 4 hours into a detailed drawing.
But even when playing with a thumbnail sketch, you have to start thinking about it somehow. We'd suggest two polar opposite starting points. Try each and see which is best for you. The first is to use references, a lot of references.
If possible, get your feet on the ground and start taking photos of landscapes and details that interest you. Nothing beats experience, taking the sounds, the smells, the feel of the terrain. Liz and I have gone through gorges, waterfall hikes, caves, urban wandering, and more. I credit Hocking Hills with the Starfall Mountain setting featured in Volume 2. True, Starfall is a total fantasy setting with otherworldly features. Nothing like those reversed trees or luminescent slopes exists on Earth, but it all flowed from the same sense of wonder and natural beauty that were inherent in that real-world experience. So get out there and explore a corner of the world. But we can't all appear everywhere we'd like. Fortunately, the internet opens an endless treasure chest of reference, but how to use it? You don't need to trace photos directly, they still provide a great starting point. A realistic landscape complete with props, atmosphere, detailed architecture, rubble, everything. You no longer have to formulate every item from scratch. You've got a palette of options, and you can start customizing from there.
Change up the camera angle, or rearrange foreground, middle ground, background. You can alter some details, remove props, add new ones, and generally use the photo as a starting point from which you can customize to your heart's content. Starting with references immediately defeats the intimidating stare of a blank sheet of paper. But there's a totally different way to sink your teeth into drawing your background.
Imagine your setting not as a landscape, but as a character, complete with mood, personality, and backstory. How is this setting feeling today? What is the vibe it puts out? What happened in the past to make it this way?
Let's dive into this example from Dreamkeepers Volume 5. The first impression we get is dark, furtive. The foreground has a burned-out structure almost silhouetted in shadow, with a twitchy, hunched sentry. Yet, this isn't a pure hellscape. These buildings were once beautiful. The castles and multi-story houses speak of prosperity that has decayed. Now we see boarded up windows, trash in the streets, bottles, bricks, rough canvas draped over bare boards, with neon graffiti scrawled across every easily accessible surface. Not artistic graffiti, just lazy territorial tagging. The far background is lost in a murky fog. This setting represents a character once noble who has deteriorated into a bitter, watchful shell of their former self.
Now, when we drew this scene, I didn't have every bottle and brick in my head right at the get-go. Drawing an elaborate setting is often a process of discovery. You reach out into imagination and discover things. But you can't excavate details if you don't even know where to start digging. So bear in mind, if this place was a character, how are they feeling? What is their mood? What is their backstory? How do you want the audience to feel? Start there. Your creative choices flow from that, and you'll intuitively sense which details are right.
Before we dive into how to draw settings, let's look at the importance of what to draw. You may have heard of the dreaded E-word exposition.
Some writers hear about exposition and think that it's inherently bad. When a character stops, stares at the reader, and recites the history of the local monastery and reminds them out loud that their brother is related to them because they were born of the same parents, which is why they are returning here to celebrate their birthday, readers tap out.
But that's not because exposition is bad. Exposition is necessary. Every story needs to provide the context that allows the reader to understand what is happening. But when exposition is done poorly, it juts out awkwardly, as characters suddenly recite facts that they know, to nobody in particular, and clearly stilted info drops on behalf of a not-so-subtle author.
Isn't that right, Liz, who is my wife and who works on a comic with me?
I think they get it.
Yes, the audience who is watching this video with their eyes using the internet, which is...
Get on with it! Yes, get on with it!
Handling exposition is a writing skill necessary for every medium, but comics have a huge built-in advantage when it comes to this. You can add all the exposition you want into the background detail of your setting, and it becomes not boring but lush and fascinating. In an instant, readers will see what they need to know, as long as you put the thought into making sure that it is there for them to see.
If you do your job well, they may even come back later and discover more clues and nuggets supporting your narrative. For one example, let's look at North Havenville in Dreamkeepers Volume 5. We had a huge pile of information we wanted readers to know about this setting, and we put virtually none of it into word balloons. The characters had other things to deal with, other stuff to talk about, so we leveraged the backgrounds to speak for us. The row of sails clearly indicates some kind of organized, even industrialized process is underway. It shows this is a region with some specific industry occurring. The characters being out alone indicates there's some level of safety this close to town. Lighthouses, docks, and ships in the harbor show that travel and trade factor large into local life, and the desolate blue dunes hint that this maritime trade is key to sustaining the economy.
The gazebo trees are a fantasy invention. The evergreen elements give a more northern feel to the setting, while the gazebo elements are played up with the railings and flags installed on trees within the town, adding a colonial upper crust feel. This is emphasized by the quaint, individually decorated houses and the boardwalks. There is literally a grandma in a rocking chair. No trash or refuse in the streets. Instead, we see light posts, flags, planted shrubberies, and armed patrols. We soon realize that in addition to mounted guards, many of the lighthouses and trees double as lookout posts, indicating that this is a comfy little town despite its circumstances, not because of them.
A rail system connects the town to one structure very different from the rest. A military green warehouse looming at the top of a rise, with the tracks zigzagging up to access points. The warehouse has cannon emplacements on top, and leads one to wonder why this structure is so different from the others. And finally, we see Hull Hall inside and out. This gathering place has been built from the hull of a ship mounted up on rocks by the coast. Inside there is a fully stocked bar, a large plate glass window with a view, and a circle of desks around a map with lanterns and cloth on the table that we can observe are used for indicating council votes. Telling you all this here in this video took up time, and in a book it would have taken a pile of word balloons, dialogue boxes, narrative exposition, except that it didn't. All this and more was delivered to the reader instantly, painlessly in the form of pretty pictures. You can transform your exposition from boring imposition to lush immersion if you play your cards right. That is the power of a living landscape.
So remember, you can say an enormous amount with your backgrounds. Develop cool, interesting, relevant world-building details, and then literally show them in your art. Now let's explore the best methods to do exactly that.
Perspective is the foundation for any environment. It's not just important for geometric objects like buildings. Trees and hills recede towards vanishing points too, and even a flat, empty, infinite parking lot has a horizon line. I usually start every scene by sketching a horizon line in, which determines the elevation of the reader viewpoint, and then I'll sketch some perspective lines going to a vanishing point, and even if it's done loosely, this gives a basic sense of the three-dimensional space. From there, it's helpful to conceptualize the background into different slices of depth: foreground, middle ground, and background. Different planes of depth can be used as framing elements. And don't be afraid to get big, bold, shaping silhouettes. Buildings, cliffs, trees, they can all achieve more shape and variation than you might think at first, giving you an infinite palette of planar framing elements. A heavy overhang in the foreground can give the impression of peering out from concealment. If it's underneath, it feels a little more like cover. Diagonals or arcs can pump up the dynamic feel of a composition.
There's major overlap with layout and design at this stage of the landscape drawing. Think about the major focal regions of the image, how you want the eye to flow, and if there are any big curves, cuts, or dramatic compositional features.
We'll get into the rule of thirds in more detail later. For now, just know that most compositions benefit from a focal area that is off-center. That asymmetry puts the image off balance and creates a dynamic flow that can move the reader through your scene. Sometimes new artists feel like characters need dynamic energy in life, while backdrops are static and boring. But every setting has energy. Feel how it's flowing, and unless you want a deliberately subdued atmosphere, find ways to juice it up.
A design concept that helps this is that of primary, secondary, and accent shapes. What is the most important thing in the scene? That's your primary design element. Help it jump out by giving it more value, contrast, and placement in one of the major energy centers of the composition. The reader's eye will start there. What do you want them to look at next? As you're sketching the setting, plan the journey your reader's eyeball will chart. Even sketch it loosely in blue line pencil, like a gesture drawing.
Then you can use tiny details to help that flow. The direction of grass or clumpy dirt texture, power lines, the placement of scrapes or wood grain on walls, even the placement of vanishing points. All of this will harness details so they are more than just texture. They're bringing vibrant flow to your landscape. An early example, this panel in Volume 1 has Mace falling into the sea. The value contrast is the most intense with that lightning bolt putting equally bright rim light on Mace, who is the primary focus of the scene, decisively off-center. The eye follows Mace's momentum, being helped further down by the lightning bolt itself. There it hits the ocean, which surges up to the left with clear dynamic energy. We see it battering the Sandman as that thing tries to hang on for dear life. And even though we can't really see the horizon line exactly in this illustration, it has been placed lower, meaning that we have a slight worm's eye perspective, and that causes the dock pylons to converge slightly upward, drawing the eye higher, until we hit the side of the orphanage cafeteria, which brings us back towards Mace and the rope flinging him outwards.
There may not be a ton of detail and props in this image, but it's a good example of harnessing the powerful surging energy to lead the eye.
So, you've got an idea of what personality this setting has, the foundational perspective basics are roughed in, and you now have a strong compositional flow with foreground and background planes, framing elements, and the placement of your primary, secondary, and accent design features. Whew! Now we just have to fill this design up with stuff.
Most new artists err on the side of settings that are too empty. When you can't think of what to draw, the result is often room interiors that look like blank, unlived in boxes.
It's easy to draw your 2-point perspective room and then have everything lined up properly. But that's not how real life works. There are imperfections in the furniture with a slight tilt this or that way. Sometimes a chair will be a kitty corner. How often do people put a cardboard box into a room and then pull out a yardstick to make sure it aligns perfectly parallel with the walls? Geometric objects, books, notepads, clutter, they should all be at various angles. To do this, take the vanishing points you've established for the overall setting, and for a separate object, scoot them to the side. This literally simulates tilting that object in space relative to the environment.
Now occasionally, you do want to draw a lifeless prison cell, or plop Neo in the Matrix. But that's the exception. The rule is, fill your space with items. Real-life living environments accumulate books, pens, furniture, lopsided rugs, lamps, cords, phones, toys, napkins. Do these characters clean? If so, you can give them books in neat stacks or on shelves. This is where the reference can be invaluable. Reality fills up the clutter. Even the forest, there are fallen trees, drooping vines, skeletonized dinosaurs, tumbles of stone, eroded stream banks, not to mention one of my personal favorites, hidden creatures.
When drawing clutter, natural or artificial, think in terms of clusters. Rarely will everything be evenly spaced uniformly within an area. Things stack up in convenient spots, and there will be blank areas adjacent to regions with dense detail and texture. This is the contrast principle at work, and it helps ensure your landscape, though filled with glorious detail, doesn't feel suffocating. Clusters of detail and open space provide variation that facilitates energy flow and lets the composition breathe. Also, vary your line weight on the detail clusters. A haphazard stack of clutter or a snarl of tree roots might have an overall heavier contour, and then the individual items within are more lightly defined. This helps the overall shape read more clearly despite the detail. It's a variation on the primary-secondary accent design principle. Within the overall framework of your backdrop, this principle can continue being applied to sub-elements almost like a fractal. This provides multiple levels of depth and detail to give your readers a truly enriching imaginary journey.
Also, just because a small item in your composition is subordinate, doesn't let it be boring. Tree roots aren't just tubes sitting there. Use a contour line to show twist, how they claw up or spread down. Stacks of books can even have twist if they get dropped, and momentum and surface friction offset how much they slide relative to one another. Twist things, crunch things, give them some character and life. A bunch of boring items can combine to make a more interesting scene, but if they all have energy and personality of their own, feeding an overarching design, the effect is powerful.
Clutter clusters help, but nothing lets a composition breathe and channel energy like pure negative space. The ultimate use of the contrast principle, and even more potent when you're rocking some great detail and texture in your setting. Use stylistic negative space to totally blank out areas of an illustration. This can be especially effective if a previous establishing shot shows the reader all the detail and they understand the stylistic nature of the subsequent composition. Negative space can also be used more naturalistically. Lean heavy into the foreground framing elements and push the background more into the misty distance. And as far as the foreground plane is concerned, negative space has been achieved. This can allow you to fill a panel with detail without making it feel crowded or stuffy.
Open skies can also serve this purpose beautifully. Literally beautifully. Clear blue glimmering stars, even when filled with elaborate cloud formations. Skies convey an ethereal and airy lightness. We could do an entire video on skies. Suffice to say here, they punch above their weight class when it comes to mood and visual appeal.
Learning to control the color palette is a necessary skill for immersive backdrops. Most settings are not an explosion of chromatic candy colors. Certain hues and tones tend to dominate.
Shabby cities will have desaturated grayish colors as the bare concrete shows through weathered paint. Deserts, forests, beaches, various districts, or cultural events all will have characteristic colors that make them distinctive from one another.
One example, this Prelude comic where Bobby has tracked down a mysterious address. The foreground cobblestones are in shadow, with the building beyond better lit, but both are variations of neutral stone and brick. The building looks decidedly grungy with green seaweed growing up the sides and corroded burgundy and green metal roofing. The dock boards are weathered and bleached, but color enters the scene from two major sources, chromatic yellow safety buffers encircling the concrete pylons, creating protection for docking boats and serving as a literal visual warning. The yellow is repeated a few places, including a control arm subtly in the faded address sign and in Bobby himself. The most notable color, though, is a lush teal, broadened by the water and the murky mist. Although everything looks run down and gross, the water is a clear counterpoint, adding a little sparkle of visual appeal to the scene. It is also the addition of this chromatic water that helps prevent the neutral build-in from totally draining the scene of color. This color scheme, neutrals, lush teal with yellow accents, is unique to this setting and Prelude.
We now know how to craft dynamic, lushly detailed environments, leveraging negative space for maximum appeal. Next, we can tune this instrument to convey mood, even beyond character facial expressions. The setting may be the biggest lever when it comes to establishing the mood of your scene. Bright, relaxing, overwhelming, dark, even the same physical environment can feel completely different with a simple change of weather or lighting. We leverage sunshine, or in Andaruna, moonshine, drizzles, downpours, fog, sunsets, and more to help convey mood. But there's more to mood than weather.
Even the way you juxtapose your landscape can boost mood. A character feeling triumphant might be viewed from a lower angle, putting them relatively higher, in the sky, even on the top of a mountain peak. Whereas elevating the camera angle, looking down on them, you can make them seem smaller or more isolated, surrounded or trapped by their environment. Putting heavy items above a character can make them seem sheltered and safe, or as though they are in peril under a sword of Damocles. It's really all in the execution of the details and the scene context. You can even have different regions of an environment convey different moods.
The back cover art for Prelude Collection 2 uses the foreground as a literal frame for the background. The background is mystical, a cold night with glowing cool colors. The foreground has contrasting warm lighting and tones.
This illustration of Mace watching a storm roll in has some subtle variations in the mood of the landscape. The foreground is dark, windswept, and feels similarly cold and foreboding. Areas of the storm are dark, but even so, heavenly light pushes chroma and color into various levels of the clouds. And in the distance on the horizon, bright light glimmers, implying dark times are ahead, but at the end of it, there is hope. This illustration leads to another landscape element, atmospheric perspective. As it turns out, air isn't quite invisible. The more air you'll look through, the more it's going to color and fade the distant objects. Especially if the air is misty or foggy, you can convey the humidity in a scene by how heavily you lay on the atmospheric perspective.
This can be done in post, during the color process. Just make a fresh layer above your whole scene, and use a nice soft airbrush to color the haze in. Based on the time of day, any range of colors could be used. Then mask out foreground elements and bam, you have atmospheric perspective.
But you want to start thinking about this even before the coloring begins. When drawing, render objects in the foreground with heavier, darker line weights. They're closer, more tangible. Even the texture on a nearby feather will have much heftier lines than those defining a battleship in the far distance. The further the object, the lighter and wispier the lines. This effect can be exaggerated, giving the impression of fog or rain during the raw pencil stage. Last, but most certainly not least, lighting. Another topic that needs a video unto itself, but we've got to dip into it here. Literally nothing in your environment can even be seen without light. And what kind of light?
Daylight, moonlight, artificial light, luminescent characters, glowing rock formations, explosions, fire, spells. Light is one of those magical ingredients that can turn even a dull scene dramatic. Entire genres of film are known primarily for their bold use of lighting as a design element.
One example of this is Bast's encounter under the docks in Volume 5. While the evening is still suffused with bright color, Bast watches from shadow. The dockboards create dramatic stripes of light that give the scene a punchy flavor, and on top of that, camera placement uses those stripes to emphasize exactly what we want. The first panel, they radiate from a distant perspective point, helping to join the physical foreground elements in the job of framing the backdrop as the focus. In the third panel, the mysterious intruder has the stripes of light behind him horizontally, revealing, just barely, his dark silhouette. The lateral juxtaposition emphasizes his flat emotional affect, controlled, steady, and level. Then the light falling more chaotically on the sand shows Bast's disturbed state, and in the end, the light bars serve to lead the eye dramatically to the character's exit from the scene. If everything was lit evenly, none of these effects would have contributed to the storytelling. This is just one example that light doesn't just add flavor, but can be a crucial compositional element to your setting.
Look for opportunities to use shadows to lead the eye and perform other compositional duties, in addition to boosting your narrative objectives. Light and time of day is used strategically throughout the North Havenville sequence in Volume 5, beginning in a cool, bright day with the colors getting warm as the characters settle in and feel safe. But the color intensifies as the sun sets, until it is a raging crimson, violence explodes in an all-out action scene, and then finally cools off and the colors fade into twilight.
When you're writing your comic and illustrating your scenes, always consider how you can use weather, light, shadow, and other ingredients to amplify the narrative. Detective time! Let's close by analyzing a couple of examples and see how they achieved their effects. First, the two Prelude comics we touched on at the beginning.
First, you have Vanth and Bast in the school waiting room. The setting doesn't convey much info, the chairs are institutional looking, clean, the room is blank except for one PSA on the wall, and a rack of brochures on a side table. It's okay for a waiting room where two characters meet, but if we spend too much time here, it would get dull fast. Even during the brief stay in this room, we make sure to use a pleasing organic panel border and subtle afternoon light, putting a dapple pattern on the wall behind them for some level of pleasing visual interest. Even a low-information, one-time use setting needed some subtle touches to keep from being distractingly dull. Fortunately, Bast flips a chair and breaks the window very quickly.
Now let's look at the introduction of V's bunk room. It has two sides, and further inspection shows they tell a story. First of all, it's in the orphanage dockyard, but within the hull of Grun's ship, separate from the boys' sleeping area. The weathered boards and canvas roof make it clear this is not a wealthy household. One side of V's room features bolts of fabric, pinned notes, designs, and inspiration, plus spools of thread and a drawing board with an outfit design sketched up. The other side has lumber, woodworking tools, and a rudimentary stool. This lets us observe V's fashion designer aspirations while also looking at the manual labor realities that she has to keep up with. Also in the mix is a pile of school stuff, backpack, data scroll, books, along with an overflowing clothes hamper and a few dishes. V may not be fastidiously clean, but would probably defend herself by saying she is balancing a lot. All of this without having the characters once mention fashion design or carpentry.
This is a good example of the opportunity you have when showing a character's living space. That space will show the audience very clearly who they are, whether the character likes it or not.
Another setting that was far too much fun to assemble was the Mansion of Eternity, discovered when the characters were questing for the subterranean archives in Volume 4. Flame orange light streams up from the ground below this massive structure. The dripping stalactites make it clear this castle has been interred for huge amounts of time, yet there are gaping holes with fresh rubble punched into the walls. Within, the massed pile of dropped scrolls and books attests that this is indeed the final resting place of the literature dropped into the mysterious hole in the library far above. Cobwebs and sheets of dust show that this place has been untouched for long periods of time, but one block has been pried from the far wall. Within, things get even weirder. A table with no top, thrones with spikes set in their back, stairways to nowhere, solid stone carvings of doors, twisting maze-like passages, all with that orange light beaming up continuously. This set the stage for the narrative while also providing lavish hints about the backstory of this environment, which, naturally, more of that will eventually come to light.
Just part of the fun when creating living landscapes in your story. We hope this video has set you on the path to putting your characters not just into spectacular events, but into a spectacular setting.
But be careful. Once they come to life, backgrounds can get addictive. Thank you again for watching. Please feel free to share with any artists or friends who might find this helpful. Creating comics the Dreamkeeper's way is being offered entirely free, so it does help us enormously when people are willing to share, and we hope this will bring some more awesome comics into the world.
Comment below to let us know what you would like to learn about next. We check out all the early comments, so we try to help with questions too.
Liz and I would love to share our comic with you. Check out dreamkeeperscomic.com. Our award-winning fantasy action story is completely free to read, and you can see firsthand how we developed our skills from the earlier comics to the current ongoing graphic novel saga. A huge thank you to the patrons you see listed here. They keep our comic alive and allow us to continue this video series. We'll be sharing sneak peeks of what we're up to in the Backers Only Dream Cord as we create more.
Thank you again for listening, and keep on creating what you love.